So continuing to focus on this stage one, helping an organization anticipate the need for change and to kind of conceptualize what's necessary to actually create an environment or a culture within an organization that is going to be adaptive to change and actually has structures to create a renewal process of innovation and effectiveness. And often, creating the climate for change is the first major challenge. And it's a challenge of management, but it's also a challenge of OD. In other words, creating this concept of a culture for renewal system to develop long-term efforts to make an organization more adaptive. And a part of that, culture is often the key to success. We often find that culture both can, that basically think of culture as a moderating effect. If you have a culture within an organization, and culture can be the norms, the current behaviors, the viewpoints, but it's kind of the gestalt, if you will, or the combination of all of the various parts of the organization that result in kind of a psychological set of constructs or contracts of how the individuals in the organization expect the organization to function. And that culture can be inducive or helpful to creating a renewal system, or it can be resistant. And often culture is one of the first things that we may target from an organizational developmental standpoint to change. How do we actually get that culture to move to one that is helpful to organizational development? So cultural change is the result of a complex strategy, and it's not an easy thing to change, and that's mainly what we're going to talk about in this particular set of the module for the second week. How to actually conceptualize what's needed and how cultures work in organizations to actually create a change in a organizational culture which would allow further innovation. So the first thing we have to do is kind of just understanding corporate culture. Static organizational culture is generally not effective. So that's, again, a broad statement that when we have an organization that has a static, unchanging culture, we're also probably looking at an organization that's very bureaucratic and is used to a very stable environment. And that may be working at the moment. The problem is that is an organization that is going to be rigid and therefore fragile to sudden change. So culture is a system of shared values, beliefs, and behavioral norm. So the shared values are often what's being communicated by the organization, both explicitly, so state value statements. Often, whenever you walk into the chief headquarters of any major corporation, you'll often find a listing of their values communicated as you walk in the door. Um, I was recently actually at John Deere's main corporate headquarters, and as I walked into the primary, basically entry hall, you actually see the listed shared corporate values of John Deere, the industry, the company. So that shared values is both explicitly shared through value statements, through their web page, through memos, through communication, even in their design of their actual office spaces. So plaques, listings, but it also can be communicated by the actual behaviors of the managerial teams. So how do the managers actually role model these values? Do you see these values reflected in the actual top leadership? In the previous video or lecture slides, we were talking briefly about Apple computers. And we were talking about the fact that the organization broadly had an organization of renewal and innovation. But Steve Jobs, while he was actually the CEO, did not role model that same set of values. He role modeled a very kind of aggressive, passive aggressive, tantrum based managerial style. Well, that created a problem because that was communicating a counter set of values of the actual chief operating officer of that organization. So shared values aren't just written statements, they're statements that are also then role modeled by the managerial or top-down teams. Beliefs are getting more towards those psychological contracts we mentioned briefly at in the initial module of this class. And those psychological constructs, again, are the assumptions that every individual within the organization makes about how those values are communicated, whether those values are actually valued, but also what are the expectations of the roles and their position within the organization. And finally, we have behavioral norms. So what are the behaviors that are accepted? What behaviors are rewarded? What behaviors are basically punished? And these behavioral norms can include communication norms, they can include social norms, they can include dress codes. um, reporting structures, all of that becomes norms. So again, an organization may have a written statement of how communication is supposed to occur in an organization, but what is the reality of how that is? So I've often been in organizations where upper management has an open door policy. So if you have direct reports, they're encouraged in writing and in structure to be able to go above your head if they want to talk to anyone within the structure of basically the hierarchical structure of management. However, in reality, everyone in the organization knows that it's a no-no, if you will, to do so. That you should only be going to basically your supervisor with problems, and should avoid having to ever go above that person's head. So that's an example of a shared value that is being actually communicated, but the behavioral norms say don't actually do this. So when we're looking at the culture of an organization, we do want to start with what are the stated or explicit values. What are the stated beliefs? So stated beliefs are actual job descriptions, role descriptions, communication information, so employee handbooks. And what are the stated behavioral norms? But then we want to ask, what are the actual values communicated through role modeling? What are the actual psychological beliefs of the organization's individuals? And what are the behavioral norms that have been basically reinforced through experience within that organization of the reality of how these written documents are actually used? So we often need to observe these behavioral norms. It's a two-step process. What does the organization believe its culture should be through writing and through explicit documents? And then what is it actually at? And what are the dominant values? Um, and how does the organization actually communicate these values? So learning the ropes for newcomers, is there actual orientation, or is it a mentor system, or do people just learn through their own observation of, okay, I know what I read in the employee handbook, but let's see what is actually happening in the organization. And generally speaking, we have two subsystems here. We have the organizational subsystem. That's the actual creation of value statements, creation of employee handbooks, possible creation of actual onboarding procedures, and then the actual managerial, or what I like to refer to as the role modeling aspect. How is this actually being implemented? And both of those are areas we can look at to possibly help us change an organizational culture. So generally speaking, culture is the assumptions that people make about the organization, its values, its beliefs, its norms, which result in their actual behaviors in the organization, which can lead to either positive or negative results. So just briefly, the managerial subsystem creates the culture in a way. It has a direct impact, and it's probably the lever we would want to use the most. Because when we look at the managerial subsystem, we're basically finding out how our employees are treated, what actions managers take, what words are used, and what vision is being articulated by top management, and then how is that vision being transferred through each level of management through an organization. And are those managers then role modeling these values in a way that positively inputs or impacts culture, or negatively impacts culture? And then the organizational subsystems that create culture include outside factors, so market, environment, culture of the not the culture of the organization, but culture of the company, the organization, or not company, country the organization finds itself, or multiple countries helps define the culture. Technology, job descriptions, type of structure, tall versus flat, all of these impact culture. So how well jobs are defined is going to impact how people perceive and react to the culture of the organization. Technology, so whether the organization, what types of technology are necessary for the organization to function is going to have a direct impact on the kind of culture that you will actually find within that organization. But also remember that when we mention technology, we're often also talking about communication and the ability to communicate information. And also the type of structure. The taller the organization is, it's going to lend itself to a more bureaucratic type of culture. The flatter it is, so the less levels and the easier it is for individuals within the organization to communicate more directly with management, a flatter organization is also going to have a direct impact on culture. So just a model to kind of think about how culture is formed. We have three kind of main subsystems in a feedback loop. We have the managerial formation, which is communication of values, the actions or role modeling of the managerial team, how well they're incorporating the visions of the organization in how they manage, and also managerial philosophy. So, what kind of actual managers are they? Are they actually developmental managers? Are they more objective, reward and punishment managers? What does that look like? Because that is going to have a strong impact on corporate culture. The organization itself, so the structure of the organization, the systems within that organization to communicate information about culture, the technology and roles of individuals within that culture are all going to impact how culture actually develops. And finally, we have the actual corporate culture itself, that shared sayings, jargon, feelings, and basically, again, the beliefs of people within the organization, their shared assumptions, and also their behavioral norms. And all three of these should hopefully have feedback loops. So we want to measure corporate culture to determine what is the current culture, and then ask if we want to change that culture, what is the best loop to use? Do we want to change the managerial philosophy? Do we want to change how managers are acting upon the corporate culture? In other words, the employees in the organization. Maybe we need to change the organization itself, how it's structured, what technology and communications it uses, or what roles it's defining in its organization. And maybe we're looking at changing all three. Generally speaking, the two big tools we have to change a culture is the managerial path or the organizational path, or both. But then we also need to monitor the actual corporate culture itself. Are these changes having the impact we hope to succeed? So corporate culture and success, high-performing companies generally have a very strong culture. So what that means is that when we find a high-performing company, we usually find a company that has a well-defined culture. So it's not ambiguous. People understand the values, they understand their assumptions. The match, if you will, between the stated, explicit values, beliefs, and structures is similar to the actual reality of how those structures are role modeled and actually implemented day to day. And hopefully, we also have a culture that is open to adaptation, innovation, communication, and change. Many cultures, however, even strong cultures, may fail to adapt to to change. And in fact, we do find organizations that have been successful at creating a strong culture, but that strong culture itself was not a culture that was actually a culture focused on organizational development, innovation, adaptation, and renewal. So I have just some quick examples of some companies that less than a decade ago were fairly relevant throughout the organization. So Blockbuster, KB Toys, my entire youth, basically ages 4 to about 14, were spent lusting after things at KB Toys. Walden Books is probably from 14 on for me, and both of them are gone. All three of these organizations are either completely closed and gone, or have been basically merged or grabbed up by their companies. And all three of them are examples of fairly strong cultures. Walden Books worked hard to create a culture of education and learning and adventure in their staff. KB Toys, fun, creating environments. Basically, again, the focus on the people that worked at KB Toys was creating a strong culture. And Blockbuster definitely branded itself very well, had a corporate culture that was fairly strong. But none of these had a corporate culture that was focused to adaptation. So following corporate mergers, also another thing to recognize is that as corporations actually merger, so as companies buy each other, a very good example of this right now, kind of topical, is Bass Pro Shops, an outdoors outfitting company, has recently bought Cabela's, a competing company. And currently, the two companies are trying to figure out how to actually merge their cultures because they have different cultures. They have different focuses on how they brand themselves. They have different focuses on how they interact with customers. Even their customer support programs are fairly different. So how do you actually do this? And generally what we find is what occurs most often is one corporation's culture will become the dominant one and will slowly start to infect, if you will, or change the culture of the other company. Currently, in the example I just used, Bass Pro Shops is trying to keep the two corporate cultures separate. They acquired Cabela's, but they're wanting to maintain and basically take advantage of the fact that Cabela's did have a different way of looking at the marketplace and one that had been fairly successful. Only time will tell if this continues, but past history has told us that the natural tendency of things is when you have a corporate merger, you're going to see culture clash, and one culture or set of cultural traits is going to become dominant in both organizations. Now, knowing this, that also tells us that the information I've been talking about, how to kind of visualize how to change a culture, it's better if we go ahead and take control, again, proactive renewal, recognize there is going to be culture clash here in a merger situation. How do we actually manage that change in a meaningful and planned way? So just some key factors to actually improving culture. When we're talking about trying to change culture, we're talking about creating a vision for the future, and it's generally a good idea to develop a long-term model for change and actually have rewards for those change. So this is a pretty good model of kind of conceptualizing the process and also the complexity at changing an organization's culture. So generally, the first phase is going to be creating a climate for change, a recognition that there is something in the culture that needs to be changed. Usually an increased urgency, often driven by outside or environmental factors, which creates the desire to build a guiding team to actually create a structural change or a plan change to that culture. Deciding how to actually change that culture, again, looking at the managerial and organizational subsystems. And then usually the final phase of that is at least getting the right vision. So this is usually a top-down process of creating what are the key corporate values, what is the key cultural norms that we want to communicate in this organization, and what are the broad tools we're going to use to do that. The second phase is engaging and enabling the entire organization to make these changes. So we're talking about communicating this new culture, talking to top management on how to model this new culture, basically getting the information into every employee's hands of this is where we're moving, this is why we're moving, and also to communicate buy-in. A lot of organizations will actually have the employees themselves through the processes of focus groups and surveys to actually have some input on what should be the corporate culture. So basically measuring what the current culture is, but also what would an ideal culture be. We then empower action, so we basically give managerial and employees basically rewards and the time to actually implement these new behaviors. And we try to create short-term wins. So come up with ways to actually reward the organization itself as this culture changes. The main thing, though, is to not just stop at this phase. So the green phase, stages 4, 5, and 6, the enabling and engaging the organization, is the implementation phase. But a lot of times organizations will start this phase and end basically with those short-term wins. And what often happens is organizational culture is a additive effect of every individual person in the organization's perceptions of that organization. So an engaged effort to change an organization's culture can be successful, but you need to be aware of the fact that what you're trying to change is the old way of doing things. And if you stop applying pressure, if you stop applying interventions to change this culture, the natural tendency of organizations is to snap back to their original culture. So 7 and 8 is implementing and sustaining that change, not letting up, continuing that information, continuing communicating, creating new employee orientation programs to make sure that everyone coming in is coming in with this vision of change, this vision of this new organizational culture, and making sure that it actually sticks. So the main purposes of what we just talked about was, again, we're still at phase 1 of the 5 phases of organizational development. We're still talking about how to conceptualize the need for change and creating the right internal environment for change. And a part of that is one of our first organizational change goals, the changing of culture if necessary, to create an organization that is going to, by its nature, be adaptive to other changes we would make. So I hope you're getting kind of a broad feeling for ways to communicate the need for change, ways to identify whether a culture is needing to be changed, and then the ability to tell decision makers in an organization, okay, I know you're wanting to change the structure of this organization because you recognize a need for efficiency. But what I'm telling you right now is, and through these models, we first need to make sure that the employees are going to be on board with this change, that there is a culture within our organization that welcomes innovative change. Because otherwise, if we just charge in with a structural change, we're going to get a lot more resistant and it's going to be less likely to succeed.